Good afternoon. I'll call the June 27th special town council meeting to order. The purpose of our meeting tonight is mainly to approve or act on a number of items related to the upcoming year's budget, to have a workshop, and to end the meeting with a executive session. So we'll start right off with roll call, and all council members are present. Agenda review. We are removing from the agenda, from the consent agenda, order 22-132.
We're just gonna remove it completely.
Yes, we are removing it. We will not be acting on that item tonight. We will see that again at some future date in some form. So move, any other agenda adjustments? Okay, and we'll move on to new business and order 22-109. Order approving the fiscal year 2022-2023 municipal budget. I'm going to summarize rather than read every line, if that is all right with folks.
First, he has to do the second.
Okay.
So on our 2022-23 municipal budget, the total municipal expense is $12,306,848. The total municipal revenue is $6,833,721, which leaves a total of $5,473,127 to be raised by municipal taxes. Sophie, is there, to have a motion now to approve that?
Move approved.
Cheryl, seconded by Megan. Do you have any comments to be made on this item?
I think the only comments I have is that staff presented this budget, initial draft budget in late April, early May to town council, went through a series of 6 budget workshops and held the public hearing 2 weeks ago. There were no comments at the public hearing, which is why these numbers have been brought forward.
And I would just like to say that there have been adjustments made in this budget from the budget originally presented. We appreciate the work of our staff and manager, and that the municipal tax request on this budget is less than last year, which we are very pleased with, as a result of increased state revenue and the use of one-time federal fund for one-time expenditures. Any council comments or questions? Certainly have improved this a number of times. Is there any, can you tell, Sophie, is there anybody from the public out there that?
I am staring, and Paul is the only one that is on, and his hand is not up.
All right, so I guess I just wanted, I don't intend to vote in support of this, so I wanted to just give a quick kind of synopsis as to why. Absolutely appreciate the work that staff and admin has done. I think the asking less from taxpayers is obviously a key component, and one where we like to focus on. But I am still a little bit stuck on the fact that we could not really reduce our operating budget. We started with I think 957,000 or 977,000 operating budget, and ended it. It came down 977, came down to 957. So and I don't know that we actually cut. I think there might have been a shift there, but I'm not entirely clear where that 20,000 went. But I don't think we've done significant work or enough work to reduce the operating budget. And as we know, operating budget is going to be, once it's in there, it's really hard to get out. So I think that's, while I agree it's important that we want to lessen the load on taxpayers, that's a key component. The fact that we're getting $900,000 more from the state, I would have hoped we would have been able to reduce our operating budget. So that's why I will be voting in support.
Thanks, Leo. Any other comments?
I'd only like to say that, I hear what Leo's saying. We did discuss this at length. These, from my perspective, is my 6th budget season. It's just that constant kind of reminder that there is a service level in this town that seems to be what folks want. And so for me, the operating budget, while we didn't make drastic reductions this year, the purpose of that lack of reduction, from my perspective, is to maintain a service level that our residents expect and want. So that's the position we find ourselves in every year, right? Do we decrease the service level or do we keep the service level as is? This year, we're keeping the service level as is, and so the operating budget is not seeing a lot of dramatic reduction. But I am glad that we were able to find a way to still lessen the expense for the taxpayers.
Thank you, Megan. Any other comments? Ready for vote? All those in favor? And opposed? 6 in favor, 1 opposed. Okay, moving on to order 22110, order approving water pollution control facilities budget for fiscal year 2022-2023 in the amount of $1,756,350 for operations and $101,000 for capital improvements, for a total of $1,857,350. Motion to approve, please.
Move approval. Second.
And seconded. Sophie?
So this is separate because it's a totally different enterprise for the town. We went through the revenues, proposed revenues and expenses. This does include a 5 cent per 100 cubic feet of consumption, which is your next order. And this one actually removes 1 staff person from the department and to help defray the additional significant operating increases.
Any comments from the council? Anything from the public? I assume not. Sophie?
Nope.
Ready for a vote? All those in favor? And none opposed, 7 in favor, none opposed. Order 22111, order approving an increase in the sewer use fee of $5 per 100 cubic feet of consumption from $5.85 per 100 cubic feet to $5.90 per 100 cubic feet, with a minimum quarterly charge of $70.80. Motion to approve.
So move.
Second.
Sure.
Okay.
We discussed this when we were reviewing the WPCF budget. This adds approximately $14,000 to the revenue line. Even with this increase, we are not adequately funding future reserves for WPCF, but during this economy seemed like a bad time to add. So we will be coming back next year with a rate increase plan.
And I would only add that as we review the rates of neighboring communities, we are still on the low end.
We are significantly the lowest.
Any comments on this item? Okay. All those in favor? 7 in favor and none opposed. Order 22112, order approving the 5-year capital investment plan for FY 22-23 through 2027 for the town and water pollution control facility. Motion to approve.
Approval.
And second. Second. Sophie, any?
We went through this during the budget process. It's the 5-year plan. It is available online. I don't know specifically what you would want me to, how you would like me to summarize that, but every year council adopts a 5-year plan to help with our general planning efforts.
Which is sometimes modified and
Always,
revised.
always modified and revised.
Any questions from council? None? Any from the public?
No.
All those in favor? 7 in favor, none opposed. In order 22-113, order approving a fiscal year 2022-2023 economic development budget totaling $837,669, funded by the following tax increment financing district development program. Downtown and transit oriented district, $642,169. Webster Point, $34,500. Penobscot Valley Dermatology, $50,500. Dirigo Pines Inn, $109,000, and Orono Basin, $2,500. Motion to approve, please.
Move approval?
Second.
Second.
As we went through the budget process, we looked at economic development as part of the community development budget. We included the economic development budget as part of the summary for the total budget. It is not run through the same funds, so this has its own revenue stream that is not today's general fund taxes. It's those development programs, so we have to authorize that separately, which is what this order does.
Questions? Anything from the public, Sophie?
Nope.
Just want to clarify. So there are no tax funds that go towards any of this budget. Is that correct?
So I parsed that purposefully, Leo.
Correct.
When we commit taxes, we commit the sheltered value of all of the TIF districts. So the total sheltered value becomes a TIF expense on the commitment sheet. Those then fall into these dedicated, restricted development funds, and that's what you operate out of, are those funds. If I added the economic development funds into your budget orders, you would be taxing taxpayers twice for the same budget, which is why we don't do it that way.
But do 100, does 100% get funded from the TIF?
100% of this budget is funded from the TIF. Yep.
Thank you.
TIFs.
TIFs.
Any other questions? All those in favor? 7 in favor, none opposed. Order 22-114. Order approving revisions to the town of Orono fee schedule effective July 1, 2022. We have seen motion to approve.
So moved.
Seconded. There. Thank you. Sylvia?
So each year, the town council reviews the fee schedule, town staff suggests revisions to that schedule based on conversations with council or statutory changes or programmatic changes that are reflected in the budget. This year, the majority of our revisions had to do with meeting the 10-cent per page statutory change for Freedom of Access Act requests. Also getting us into the current technology age where we would use thumb drives and not CDs. There were some effort to shift to ensure that non-residents were getting services as cheaply as possible and either electing not to provide some services to non-residents or charge them more. Does that reflect?
I think so. Questions, comments? Ready for a vote? All those in favor? 7 in favor, none opposed. Great. We'll move on to our consent agenda. So I'm going to ask for a motion to approve the consent agenda minus order 22-132.
So moved.
And second? All those in favor of the consent agenda? 7-0 again. Brilliant. So now we have an opportunity to move into a public workshop. And I'm going to let Sophie introduce our guest. Thank you for being here with us. I've read your very, very interesting report. And with that, Sophie.
So for folks who weren't on council before, late last year, early this year, town council was grappling with the idea of whether or not it should be suggesting a change in the charter. When we were putting forth the charter, no, I take that back. They were grappling with the idea of whether or not they needed to make a change in the ordinance to change the amount of money that town council was paid as a stipend. And as people went back and forth with that, the general consensus appeared to be, well, we really don't need it, but might that make it easier for some individuals and groups that might not otherwise be able to participate, So I left that meeting. At that meeting, there was discussion about what it felt like, and which quickly changed to, wait a minute, we said we weren't going to make decisions based on feelings. We were going to make decisions based on data and studies and things that people have researched. So I initially left thinking that Lori Carpenter and I could do a little review of what was out there, and quickly got over my head very, very, very deep. I'm not a researcher by trade. So I reached out to the one person that I know that is steeped in public policy and has been really helpful with the town. Rob Glover is an associate professor at the University of Maine for political science and honors. Most importantly, he is really engaged with the town during his tenure. He and his students have been very instrumental in our work around downtown and our work around student engagement. We have questions and we send it to him and we often get answers. So I sent a Hail Mary, it truly was, saying, is there any chance you might be able to help me? And what I learned is that he's part of a network of pretty amazing people who do this sort of research all the time. And you received in your packet, and the public has access online to a little bit about his group, Scholars Strategy Network, and also the white paper that he provided to us. So without further ado, my guest who has really helped me out, Dr. Weber.
Thanks, Sophie, and thanks to the council. So what I was hoping to do is just kind of walk through the brief I put together for you all, kind of go through the highlights, and then leave plenty of time for questions or clarifications. So first off, I'd say that the council is really to be commended for considering this question and thinking about the role of evidence and research in how we address this question. So I think it speaks to concerns about fairness and equity and diversity, and thinking about how we ensure that those who hold decision-making power reflect the communities that they represent. So I think that's really important. Some caveats that were included in the brief, there's very little research specifically addressing the impact of municipal official compensation. So of the research that exists, a lot of it tends to focus on urban areas. So particularly for rural communities, there's just not a lot of research that addresses this directly, and basically a black hole with regard to Maine. Nobody systematically researched this. We do have a lot of research that looks at this in relation to state legislatures, and we also have a body of research that looks generally at groups who are less prevalent in elected office and what motivates them to run or not run for office. So lots of this research looks at race and ethnicity, but also quite a bit of focus on gender identity, class background, age, profession, things like that. And thankfully, the Scholar Strategy Network has some of those folks who do that research within it. So I sent a lot of emails to, also sent some Hail Marys to folks that were really helpful in suggesting things that I should go and read. So I've tried to provide citations in that brief wherever possible. Academics are not good at playing nicely and sharing. You're going to hit a lot of paywalls. So if there's something you want to delve into more deeply and you hit a paywall, let me know and I can get you access to it. Key insights emerging out of this research. There is lots of research to suggest that paying politicians more can have good outcomes, particularly with the stuff focusing on state legislatures, states like ours, where our citizen legislature relative to other states actually pays a relatively small amount of money. There's an argument to be made that higher salaries would result in more qualified candidates, better representation, more legislation introduced. But what we can't do is point to any of this work and suggest definitively that it leads to greater diversity. And this has been researched most extensively with regard to class background, but other forms of diversity as well. There are some things that come out of that literature on who runs for office and why, and how we empower people to run for office that I think are that are interesting in this respect. So what we learn is that folks who are less financially secure struggle with the balance between their professional commitments and running for office. So folks who are less well off financially tend to be more concerned about balancing their jobs and the work associated with serving in office. There's a lack of flexibility in balancing those roles that those who are more secure financially don't face in the same way. Beyond the work associated with the position, there's the public-facing work associated with running a campaign, and that can be a deterrent to running for office. So that pulls in a lot of folks who would be reluctant to run for office. Folks who are younger, folks who are not within certain professions, folks who are not upper middle class, they might not have a network, and so they need to build it, and that's really time consuming. And in that respect, modest increases in stipends for counselors probably are going to have relatively limited impacts. If we even double the amount that counselors get, it's not necessarily going to provide a big motivation for those folks to run. That's not to say that you shouldn't do it. There's lots of good reasons to compensate our public servants. One of the things that was really striking to me as I started to dig into this and look at pain, there's just a wide variation that exists between folks who are doing this in a truly volunteer capacity and then some of the more lucrative stipends that are provided to counselors. But it's just to say that it won't likely lead directly to greater diversity in candidates. So what I tried to include in the brief was some suggestions for things that might be within the purview of municipal councils that potentially would have the leverage to increase diversity. One of the things that comes up in this research is the timing of elections. And in general, trying to time elections in such a way that you have higher turnout. So I know this has been an issue in Orono in the past, but avoiding standalone municipal elections with very, very low turnout, what they find is higher turnout leads to a broader cross-section of the community and gives those who are less well represented a better shot of getting elected. So municipal elections should, wherever possible, be paired with primaries, presidential elections, midterm elections. Though I admit that within the brief, I kind of talk out of both sides of my mouth because I do talk about other communities where if you have a low turnout election and if you have a candidate who can put together a network and kind of mobilize people to turn out that otherwise wouldn't vote in that low turnout election, that they can take advantage of that to get elected to office. So in Bangor, for instance, I talk about these off-cycle elections where individuals really kind of turn out a group that otherwise wouldn't vote, and that's how they've been able to ensure greater diversity on the council. So that's one potential area, thinking about timing of elections. Electoral boards rather than at-large elections. A lot of the research here is in larger communities and it's really focused on urban politics. But a big part of the fight for racial justice in some American cities has involved this question. So you may have a case where a specific racial or ethnic group is concentrated in a certain part of the community and they would lack representation in an at-large election, but if you have a ward election, then they potentially have a shot at getting representation. You could imagine, for instance, though, if you had a ward that was largely university students, that might produce a younger candidate with a greater likelihood of getting elected. That might mobilize more young people to turn out and vote, but they might struggle in an at-large election. A third recommendation that comes out of the research is a larger council. Obviously, that lowers the threshold for getting elected. It expands the likelihood that those who are running for office, if they are struggling to build a support, or they don't have the capacity or the network that other more established folks in the community might have, they might be more likely to get elected. Obviously, there's good and bad with that. You get potentially counselors who are less knowledgeable. You might end up with a really kind of diverse council where collaboration and compromise are a bit more difficult. But I think some of those things are part and parcel of seeking a more diverse council. And the last one, which was kind of interesting to me, because one of the things I've liked about Maine is the nonpartisanship of many, if not most, communities when it comes to elections. That it's not specifically about parties, but some of the research says that's actually a real problem. That party ID is an important shortcut for voters. And so when you remove parties from local races, it makes them less intelligible to all but the most savvy and engaged local voters. So if somebody looks at a slate of candidates, particularly if it's not easy to find information about those candidates, they go on social media and they can't find that information, it can be really challenging for them to make a decision, and many voters just won't cast ballots for candidates that they don't know anything about. So that's what the research says. Obviously, with all of those, there's potential challenges and pitfalls with those strategies. I'm happy to field questions about any of them. Just a few kind of more broad things that are really beyond the scope of anything council would do, but maybe things that we can think about in our own individual capacities. One thing that I mentioned in the brief was candidate recruitment. So those who are in office play a really important role in kind of serving as a gatekeeper, reaching out to people and saying, look, I'm stepping back from counselor, I'm stepping back from school board. I think you'd be great. You should consider running for this office. That's really important to bring people in who otherwise would not consider running for office, is having someone ask them. And in particular, for some of the groups that are traditionally underrepresented, potentially asking them numerous times. Those who are in positions of relative privilege, you suggest to them that they should run for office, they kind of think about it and say, yeah, I should. But those who are not, many times are reluctant. They'll kind of say, no, I don't think I should. I don't think I'm qualified enough. And so sometimes it takes multiple suggestions that someone should run for office to kind of push them over the line, to give them the nudge that they need to consider doing it. Training, lots of groups that train and encourage traditionally underrepresented groups to run for office. Many of these are partisan, or they might be groups focused around a specific set of issues or a specific set of people that have been traditionally underrepresented. But they're legion, and I mentioned some of them, Run for Something, Emerge, AFL-CIO, the Victory Institute, and so on. And these are groups that really run the gamut in terms of different ideological orientation, left, right, center. There's all sorts of folks mobilizing and training people to run for office. And then lastly, involving and educating the community about the processes of town government. So we know, and this is good news for everybody in this room, we know that when you ask citizens about their perceptions of government, they tend to have much more warm and fuzzy positive feelings about local government than they do about state or national government. So they have this kind of affinity towards the local, but they often don't really have a sense of how it operates unless they've had to engage with it in some specific way. Or they're one of those rare people that is really engaged but not directly involved in it. So I think we can think creatively about ways to involve traditionally underrepresented groups in government and educate them about its functioning. That could be partnerships with local organizations, the university, K-12 schools. One thing that we've seen more and more communities do is to create a board focused on diversity, where you're directly recruiting from specific underrepresented groups. And so that means even if someone's not going to run for office, it gives you a mechanism to tap into those perspectives and consult them on issues where those communities are going to be impacted. And it also creates a bench. Right? If somebody served on a board or a committee, they're potentially more likely to consider running for office. That can be a stepping stone. And so Bangor actually has an example of this. I printed it out because it has a very long name, but they have their advisory committee on racial equity, inclusion, and human rights. And they actually have specific constituencies that they say there needs to be a member of this group on this board. So that's a really quick overview of some of the key insights from the brief I put together for you. One thing I will say is that there's no direct research on this. A lot of this is kind of extrapolation, thinking about the implications of findings in other areas, but this would be a great question to go and research more systematically. Unfortunately, nobody's done it, but I'm happy to take questions or provide clarification on anything that either just what I said just now or what's in the brief I put together.
Well, first, thank you very much for both the written report and your presentation this afternoon. It's very informative. Questions?
Yeah,
Cheryl?
I have a couple. I think you should do the research. That's number one. Did you run across any time reference? Like, so if a counselor, I have a couple things that I wrote down, so I'll just take all this time and then I'll pass and we'll talk again. Is there a significant amount of time, and you may not have found this in the research, between a $7,000 counselor and $7,000 a year and $1,000 a year in time spent on council? Because that, I think that's a significant, I think you get on council or you participate in municipal government without really realizing how much time it's going to take.
Sure.
And it does take a lot of time if you do it well. If you do it well and you have concerns and there's some things that you want to investigate or that you want to raise. I was also curious about, and I'm going to just use a personal story, that living in Orono, and I'm going to localizing it. Living in Orono, there is a socioeconomic group of people that can't be represented on council because of time spent. So as a single mom in Orono, raising my son, there was no way I could do this particular work because the landlords here charged by the bedroom. And so in order to stay in a house with my son, I had to pay what 3 college students would pay, right? But it was important to me to live here. So that was 3 jobs as a single mom. There'd be no way I could do this until Alex got older. But it was a concern, but it's not, we're not represented here. I'm not, well, he's 20 now, so I don't consider myself a single mom anymore. And I'm not saying that his dad wasn't around. I'm just saying that I had to have a place to live. So that's a personal story. I know that another single mom in this community had her house burned down and could not find a place to live while it was being rebuilt. So trying to have a voice in that particular group, which is so very limited. I mean, it's very limited, but trying to have a voice is difficult. Raising the pay might make it a little bit more amenable, but not necessarily. I'm not saying that that's the solution. I'm just saying that there are people in this town that cannot possibly participate because of the time, but having a little bit more compensation might make it a little bit might make it a little bit easier to be able to do it. So I think if you're less financially secure, I took your words. I think it is difficult to be part of municipal government, and especially the time that it takes to participate at a level that feels like you're making a difference. Yeah, I'm done.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. And those are both great questions that somebody, maybe should go off and research. So with regard to time spent, does increased compensation result in more of a time commitment? Will someone commit more time? We don't have any research on that at the municipal level. We do have research that suggests that's the case for state legislatures. So there have been state legislatures that have raised pay, and it's a really hard sell as a state legislator to say, oh yeah, we're going to vote in a pay raise for ourselves. But there's all sorts of good governance indicators that suggest that it pays off. And there's a lot of, I think, misunderstanding in the general public. They just kind of assume that if somebody's in elected office, that there's some sort of fat cat politician. That may be the case, and that often is not the case, especially for some of these state and local positions. So what we've seen in the case of state legislatures is that when you give people more compensation, that it results in more legislation introduced. They'll spend more time on the job. That's a really different scenario than a municipal council. So that would be one instance in which I'd really hesitate to make the leap from what happens in state legislatures, where the pay increase might be $20,000. It might mean that somebody is doesn't have to work a part-time job while they're in session, for instance. Whether or not an increase of a few $1,000s would be sufficient enough that somebody would say, this wasn't doable for me before, but now it's something I consider doing, is I think different and a more complex issue that I don't think can probably be resolved through compensation, at least not if we stay within pretty much the band of compensation that we see here in Maine, which is somewhere between $0 and maybe $4,000.
Right.
And I think, I've seen anecdotally some of those issues overcome through these support networks where, for instance, somebody running for office for whom this seems insurmountable, it seems as if it would be something that they never could achieve, if they have a network of people who have done it before, or they have people who will go out and do doors on their behalf, or help them with the campaigning side of things, at least some of those time commitments that come with getting elected in the first place are overcome. I know that once you're in office, that's
Right.
more of a lone wolf scenario. There's not somebody there to help you with your responsibilities on council. But I definitely hear your concern, and it's an important concern. I wish there was an easier, more straightforward way to deal with it
Right.
than there is.
And I was wondering, and I'm going to stop, if municipal, holding a municipal office isn't a training ground for a state representative position.
Yeah.
And if you are eliminating your municipality, your municipal people, then you're also narrowing down your state representation as well.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. So I talked about committees and boards being the bench for council positions and elected positions, but you're absolutely right that somebody running for state leg, or somebody eventually running for house candidate or something like that, oftentimes the starting point is local office. So it makes it even more of an important question that we figure this out, because if these folks are underrepresented at the council level, then they'll be underrepresented at other levels.
It's also very interesting to me that increasing the pay at the state legislature level does produce a wide variety of positive outcomes, but not necessarily increasing diversity. Especially, obviously, as you know, I'm very well acquainted with many people who run for state office. And to be able to afford to serve, to be able to afford to run, even as a clean elections candidate. There's a reason why the vast majority of our representation at the state level is older, wealthier, whiter. There's a reason. You have to either be in a position of your life where you're retired and you can comfortably live on whatever income is coming in and you can serve in office, or you have to have a very specific type of career if you're younger, to be able to have that time luxury, to be able to say, I'm not going to be here from January to April, or I'm taking a leave of absence, or I'm only working part-time. You have to own your own business, for example, or just have a very understanding employer who likes the clout that might come with having a rep, on staff. So you have a very narrow scope of candidates to begin with at the state level. So it's interesting to me that like I think of, and that was when I ran for state office, that was a very big concern for me. Will I actually be able to afford to do this if I'm elected? I think that it's interesting that the financial aspect still doesn't open enough opportunity for a diverse pool of candidates, even with, you know, my sense when we asked this question was the answer was going to be the money was not actually going to help. But I thought that it was worth exploring because obviously we should explore all avenues. What is very interesting to me are these suggestions of, and I'm very grateful that you included this in the report, of other mechanisms by which we could approach this issue. And I really want council to look at all of these very closely and implement as many as we can agree upon. In particular, I think about how we communicate what it is that we're doing. And I know that the word transparency gets thrown around a lot. And my struggle as a counselor is that frequently when people say, I want more transparency, it is frustrating because it's like, well, I'm publishing everything on the internet. I'm putting everything on social media. I'm talking to as many people as I can. We're doing all these things. And sometimes when people say, I wish there were more transparency, what they're actually saying is like, I missed that. I didn't watch that meeting. I didn't look at Facebook. I haven't gone on your website and read the massive amount of material that you put on here because I asked for it. Like sometimes that is the truth, you know, when people say there's not enough transparency. And then sometimes there really is not enough transparency. I think of, I moved to this town in 2006 and I ran for this seat in 2017. And I will tell you that between 2006 and 2017, I knew almost nothing about what the town government did, who my representatives were. I'm not sure if I voted in any of those elections because they were in March and I wasn't, what was I doing here voting in March? I wasn't, I was voting in June and November. And I'm an extremely politically active person and have been my entire life, but didn't even know how local government worked, let alone who was serving, and didn't vote for anyone. So I think that's, and if I'm a very smart, engaged, politically active person, and I spent almost a decade living in this town, not even knowing who to call if I was mad about my sidewalk not being plowed. What is the average resident, especially the average transient resident who may be here for school or just here for a period of time passing through? So I don't say this to say like the town needs to do a better job of being transparent, because I think that is, I know that that has been a central goal of this town and this council for a long time. But what are the other ways besides putting things on the website and trying to reach people on social media that we can have folks understand more about how their local government works? Because what we're seeing now since 2020 is a lot of people becoming more politically active, but still not understanding how local government works. So they're coming to us as though we are their state legislature or their federal reps, coming to us with things that may be out of our control or out of our purview, and not being able to be as effective locally as they could be because they don't know how the system works or what we even do necessarily at the local level. So I think there's a huge opportunity there for us to explore a lot of these different avenues around town, I mean, with school and other different ways that we could increase civic engagement that's not just about messaging. All of that is to say thank you.
You're very welcome. At the very beginning, you mentioned this kind of strange finding that as you increase salaries for state legislators, you actually feel like it doesn't have impacts on diversity. And that it's fascinating. So that actually relates to some states that kind of shift from more of a citizen legislature to more of a professional legislature. And so they start to pay salaries that are actually commensurate with what somebody might get outside of the state legislature.
Like the state that I come from, Massachusetts.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And the problem there is that you crowd people out. You take these people that step back from professional roles in order to run for state legislature, and you crowd out some of these traditionally underrepresented groups because you actually make it attractive for them where they don't have to forego, or they forego less of an economic hit. So
Interesting.
Other questions?
I just wanted to say thank you. This was, I wasn't on the council when this request was made. And so as I started thinking about questions, and then you sent, we got this, and I'm like, you hit them, which was awesome. So I really appreciate that. And I commend Sophie for the Hail Mary that she threw. And, you know, it's not about having all the answers, it's about knowing where to go. And so that's really great. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
I was curious, if you could say a little bit more about the pros and cons of a award model in a town of this size. I know you said there's really not a lot of research of this sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so where you typically see word models, and this is an issue, it's broad, like a big part of what's happening down in Portland right now is this battle, right, over like at large versus ward. Where you typically see wards is in larger cities. I mean, so if you have, for instance, if you have geographically isolated groups or geographically concentrated groups within a community, then the ward model gives you a mechanism to ensure that they have representation that they would not otherwise have. And that's why this is so linked in with race and ethnicity, right? So we tend to see groups self-select into communities, and then a very, very effective way to marginalize them politically has been to create an at-large system where their political influence is dissipated, and over time they either kind of radicalize and push for a change in that system, or they just kind of, that energy dissipates and they become disillusioned with the system. So the benefit of a word system is that if you have those sorts of groups, then you can create a mechanism by which they're at least more likely to have some form of political empowerment. The difficulty, I think, is that it makes things more complex for voters, right? And so it's no longer, they're no longer voting for a slate of candidates at large, and some of them they know and some of them they don't know, but they have to kind of take the focus that they would put on making that decision, and it becomes this micro level focus on really kind of like a tiny subset of the community. And it can create potential issues with kind of compromising collaboration. You might end up with people that, you know, really forcefully represent one group and only one group, and don't have kind of a more holistic picture of the community at large. I keep bringing up Bangor, but I mean, that was where I lived the first 5 years that I was here, but there was always this kind of tension between the interests of downtown and then the vast majority of the community which is actually much larger than downtown. And so I hear from business owners or people on outer Ohio that really, you know, the elected government represents this this group that is overly reflective of the downtown, and there's so much more to Bangor. So you can run into those sorts of issues where already contentious debates within communities become even more hyper-focused, and things become more difficult for voters in terms of the decision that they have to make. You can run into issues with candidate recruitment and also people, you know, we've had so many issues with people questioning legitimacy and distrusting our political system, that when you make something, when you make that profound of a change in terms of how that decision was traditionally made, there's always going to be, you know, rumblings of discomfort with that level of change. So that's kind of a rambly answer to your question.
That's great. I mean, especially your last point is especially interesting to me around just like how the districts are drawn,
Yeah.
And the perceived legitimacy of that.
Yeah, I mean, just think of like almost like a micro community level like redistricting exercise, and all of the tension and controversy that could potentially change. And the people who are going to look at a change that's significant and potentially kind of lose faith in the local elections process just because it's so different and so much of a change. So that's not to say don't do it. It's just to say that those sorts of things are really difficult. Portland's a good example of that. Is that you're just seeing these kind of battles within the community over those sorts of questions. Should we have a city manager? Should we have at large versus wards? Like those are things that seem mundane and seem kind of procedural, but actually get really important questions that can create challenges for communities.
It's interesting that, because when you say like the ward or, you know, districting format can be used to marginalize, but you also earlier said that the at-large system can be used to marginalize, and I think the lesson is all power structures can be used and are used to marginalize people, the end, period. So it's interesting to think like, well, what, when you're trying to make that decision for your own community, like what, you know, that's a tough one.
Yeah, and the problem I think is that in many cases, these seemingly procedural, seemingly objective techniques have been used intentionally to marginalize those groups, right? So it's like, we take anything and someone will figure out a way to disenfranchise and disempower somebody with it.
Comments, questions?
I guess it's really a comment. I'm just musing about the, the potential for this to feel like a really big step to Orono voters if we were to consider setting up a ward system. But, the pool of folks who typically vote in Orono municipal elections is like in the hundreds rather than the thousands. And so it's a fairly small number of folks who are actually doing the voting in a town that's much larger. And I also wonder about the potential for, if something that is sort of a large scale change with good intention becomes a topic of public debate. I almost wonder about the potential for more people to take notice of the fact that there are opportunities to vote in municipal government that otherwise just have never thought about it before or have never been engaged. That was a bit of a rambling musing, but that's where my brain went. So then Jeff pointed at me. So to you, Jeff.
Well, I raised my hand, then I realized you've been waiting. Sorry about that.
It's all good.
So I have to say, I live in the part of Orono that is represented in our state legislature by the other legislator who doesn't represent the majority of Orono. I think he's fine, does a good job, but I always feel like I'm a little bit left out of the conversation. So I think that the idea of wards can be positive, but it can feel a little exclusionary sometimes. But I was really intrigued by two other things that you mentioned. One was increasing the number of counselors, and I wonder if you found a sweet spot in Maine for the size of council, given council's responsibilities. Some towns empower their councils more than others. And I wonder if there's a perfect size.
If only there were.
One.
No.
No.
I
That's
can
the
tell you from
only
experience,
wrong
not
answer.
3 or 5.
Yeah. No, I really don't. I guess the issue that you would run into with too large a council is kind of similar to some of the issues we mentioned before, is that you can have people who actually don't have a broad base of support within the community and might not have a very great understanding of the issues, right? When they speak about issues or they're lazy, like they don't go out and do the work to meet with voters and hear what the issues are. And so if you have a number of councilors in which the slot of seats in any given election is too large, then you open the door to those sorts of issues. But it also it creates a mechanism by which people who are less well established in the community and don't have the means to tap into a broad existing network through certain types of professions or 15-20 years living within the community. So some of these more transient populations that we have, that they could potentially mobilize enough people to get onto council. But what the sweet spot is, I don't know. It's very hard to say. And likely that there isn't one. It would vary based on the community.
Question for you, Rob.
Yeah.
I was curious if you've seen any examples of at the municipal level there being funds for folks who are running for council, kind of like clean elections funds at the municipal level, because I do think that for some folks looking to step into these waters, that kind of like, how do I run for office, and wow, that costs money, can be a barrier.
I don't know of any, but it's a fantastic question. I'll say I don't know of any such thing in Maine, but there might be models for that elsewhere in the country, and I'm going to dig into that and let you know what I find, because that is a really interesting question.
It is an interesting question, and also specifically in this community, because the idea of spending money on a council election in Orono, Maine is a 2-year-old phenomenon. That's it. Like when I ran in 2017, I made a hand-painted sign and put it in front of my own house. And that was like, I remember when the last time I was up for re-election with the previous council chair, Cindy Maynard, she and I were in the same cycle, and no one else took out papers, and it was just the two of us. And she was like, we're not doing signs or anything, right? And it's like, yeah. And I feel so passionately about that. I ran as a clean elections candidate for the state. And it angered me to even have to use any of that money. Because the concept of the spending that goes into any level of running for office is so infuriating. It's so infuriating to me. And so one of the things that I have really been kind of disappointed in is that Orono for so long, it really was like, you got to know, hopefully, if you were engaged, then you got to know candidates during candidates night or in other mechanisms. But there was no campaigning really. I mean, if you were running, you talked to people, yes, but like, it's only since the last couple of years that folks have started bringing state and federal level politics to local elections in this specific town. I know it's not the same in most, at Bangor obviously has like this machine of running for office as well, and it's there. But so I kind of, it's this weird double-edged sword, because I think my sense is that the folks who have started bringing money into local elections in Orono have done it as a way to increase diverse representation of different types on council, but it has had this other weird effect of making it the new norm. And so when I think about, I'm up for re-election for the third time in March, and it's like, is this the first time I'm going to have to really campaign for this seat? Probably. And that's, to me, that's sad, not because I think I should just automatically be re-elected, but because I don't want to spend a dime of my money or anyone else's running for office when those funds could be used in better places for better things. Putting, ordering a bunch of signs is like such a disgusting waste of money to me.
But you have to do it, and it's
But
been,
that's the thing, why do we have to do it? And that's,
it's been more than a couple of years, Megan. It's been-
well, yes,
it's been
but
five
that, so
at
to me,
least.
it's a real double-edged sword. I like, if that is gonna become the new norm, yep, let's find ways to fund, I would love to have a clean elections style. And I see this in Bangor with my friends who have run for office in Bangor, where it's like, it's weird to run for a city council where there is no clean elections option. Like it's weird for people who want to run as clean elections style candidates, and then you do have to do traditional fundraising and like spend all this money, and it's odd, but.
So you just do it once, and then you just keep your signs.
Can I just take my state legislature election signs and like
Yes.
scribble out
Just
state
write them out.
legislature?
Stickers over the top.
I just put a sticker over it, it'll be great.
So I just want to highlight that there's a difference in state law with regard to candidates in Bangor and candidates in Orono. And that's that
Yeah.
we are currently still under 15,000 people. So we don't have to do the local
Yeah.
elections reporting, which candidates in Bangor have to do. It's a different setup.
Yeah.
I do think in reading your report here that there are some things that council and or the DEI committee that we are going to impanel in the near future could do to increase the candidate pool in terms of reaching out to different groups, in terms of conducting some forums on municipal government so that potential candidates better understand what the role is, what the responsibilities are, what they might be getting involved in. And that seemed to me to be kind of the low-hanging fruit that we could do without a lot of expense or a lot of effort, especially if we have the DEI committee that has some of those contacts that we might not have as council members.
I think if we're honest, I don't know, I trust that everyone at the table heard kind of the same things I heard when I said I'm running to most of the people I know. I was like, what, are you crazy?
Yeah.
So it's not.
Why do you do it again? Then they'll say you're really crazy.
It's
If
not-
people say that, they say, you still doing that?
Yeah, I mean, everyone has a kind of an impression of public service, and it's not for everyone, obviously, and probably it's just us weirdos that actually end up being okay with doing it or something, because most people I know are like, oh, it's the last thing I would ever do. So.
Yeah,
Right.
I was definitely that person who needed 5 or 10 different friends to be like,
Yeah.
run for council before I would even think about it, for sure. But I wanted to return to this idea about the timing of elections, because to me, that feels like such a good idea. The sort of March timing of our municipal elections that often is isolated from other issues, feels like it does enable low voter turnout. And I'm curious what other folks think about the idea of trying to lump it in with larger elections and maybe hosting more of our elections on campus so that it's more accessible to students. Because I think like knowing where the town office is a major impediment to student turnout. I know that to be true from many conversations with students being confused about where to vote.
Well, they did turn out really in huge numbers in 2020. The students were, I mean, the
Yeah.
lines were out the door all day long.
Yeah.
In that primary.
In November. Oh,
No, the March primary in 2020.
Yeah,
Did that have the marijuana referendum on it as well?
Presidents
And pot.
That would have
been.
that was not in March, the part was
Right.
not.
I think March elections go back to the era of town meetings, when town meetings were traditionally held when the winter snows were gone and getting ready for the coming fiscal year. And I think that many communities just kind of fell into that. We had town meetings in March. We're going to have our elections in March when they went away from the town meeting form of government.
If I'm not mistaken, in March 2020, wasn't there was the primary election and then like 2 weeks later?
Yes.
then the
Yeah.
actual
Yeah.
election.
Oh,
Yeah.
And that, we changed that, right? So those are now,
Well, what we changed was in the charter, we gave council the ability to set a different annual election as long as it's within a certain number of days of a called state or federal election. So if we could be convoluted, that's what we did.
to prevent that from happening in the future.
Yeah, because we were sealing voter lists to comply with state law that then created a real hardship for many of our community members who ended up having to register to vote twice. And
Yeah.
then we ended up with duplicates. It just was not very well planned.
And I remember, so one of the things that we've done with the town is recruited a bunch of students to serve as poll workers. And probably the number one issue that they confronted was people being confused about the timing of that municipal election and being frustrated that they couldn't just vote in that election while they were at town hall. And the research does suggest that, those sorts of like standalone municipal elections, particularly if they're, shortly after a higher turnout election, that turnout would just drop way off, which can be bad, can also be good, right? Where if you have one person who goes out there and gets 300 people to vote for them, and otherwise those people want to vote it, that can be one of those opportunities to get more diversity in council. But those are the sorts of things that happen as part of a coordinated strategy, usually with some sort of support from a group or some sort of training, not necessarily somebody going out there and doing it themselves.
So I've been with the town for a little over 11 years. And during that tenure, we have talked about the timing of municipal elections more than once. The pros I have heard for keeping it in March is, well, you'll get people who are truly engaged, making decisions and not just getting to the ballot, to the poll and checking a box because it's a cool sounding name. So the idea of you're not kind of washing out or diluting the municipal side of it. And I never really had an opinion because it truly is a council choice, but I will share just this is an opinion, not a recommendation. This is truly what I think. In the past, we hadn't had a lot of turnover on council. And so we might turn over one person. Also, the personality of engagement was a lot different 10 years ago than it is today. When we would get new people on council 10 years ago, they would not attempt to engage right away. They would kind of sit and take it all in.
I'm not saying that's good or bad.
The
it's
good old
just-
days, huh?
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying it's the
not where she's
difference,
going.
right? So one of the things that I have noticed, we just went through a budget process that people just got elected, just got sworn in, and now you're sitting here trying to decide how to fund the town, when truly there hasn't been enough of an opportunity for you to truly understand how it works and what areas could grow or could shrink. So I just wonder if we're in a new era where people want to be engaged, which is great. If it might make sense to kind of not bring people in 4 weeks before the budget drops.
I really see the wisdom in that, and I've thought a lot about, it is part for me, it's part of the issue is the timing of the election. And I wonder if June primary season would be a better time, because you could be bringing people in to start their term after the previous budget has passed, and they can spend a whole year learning how operations work before having to determine how to fund them, which I think is very valuable. The other thing is, I've always had an issue with the timing between taking out papers or having to return papers and the election. Because one of the things that I think is a huge issue, and I think everyone who has participated in and run our candidates nights, big kudos to those folks. However, it is not enough time for anyone to really get to know who a candidate is and what their knowledge base is, what kind of support they might have in town, how they might approach the job. It's not enough time. That venue is not adequate enough to really allow voters to get a sense, because unlike state and, well, we don't even really have the luxury of state level politics, but unlike national politics, there isn't this backlog of press clippings and other things on the internet or available for people to learn about. They're not public figures. They're just your neighbor that lives a few streets away, and you don't know anything about them. There's not much you can glean from trying to find it on your own. So for me, if there were more time between having to turn in your papers to run for council, and more opportunities for more types of candidate forums. We also just have a very nicey nice candidate forum where everybody is just asked a question and everyone just says for 2 minutes, they talk about what they think about the answer. And I find that to be sometimes inadequate. Not saying I want it to be like a debate, but I'm saying that sometimes I think there's more space for discussion and not just like, here's my, oh gosh, I'm running out of time already and I didn't even really say anything. Please vote for me. How do you know anything? So for me, June would solve that problem in another way, because it would give 6 months worth of time to do other things. No, why are you shaking your head at me, Sophie?
So if you want to
There's some
do,
law that prevents us.
if you want to do pre-candidate forums where people who are interested in running for government before they actually take out papers, you could do that, but under state law, papers go out 90 days before an election and are due back 45 days before the election. Absentee ballots are due, I have to open absentee ballots 30 days before an election. So that timing of that candidates forum is very purposeful, because it's got to be after, in our current setup, unless you want to do pre-candidate forums, it's got to be after the nomination papers come back and we vet, because remember, there are some things that people now have to meet a residency requirement that they didn't have to necessarily meet before. And we want that candidates night before absentee ballots are available. So I can't elongate the state process with the current legal structure. So yes, there's a law against that.
So that makes sense, but I guess if there's one thing, apart from, I was really interested in the K through 12 civic engagement kind of piece or whatever, but if there's one takeaway of an action item that I think I would like council to look at, it's figuring out a mechanism. Yes, looking at the date of the election, but also figuring out a mechanism that there is more of an opportunity somehow, in some capacity, for voters to be more educated about who they're voting for, not just spending money on lawn signs.
You have to go door to door.
Yes, of course, but, yes, but I feel like there might be other ways that we could skin that cat.
Technology. Should be.
Does this sound like you've got it narrowed down to a number of things that you might like to ship to community development? I'm just looking at Jeff and you don't look like you
Always
have
happy
anything
to
to do
add
right
things to
now.
your
so-
calendar.
Yeah, that's right. No, I think we could talk about it. Since one of the things that we haven't talked about tonight is this concept of participatory budgeting, which you gave us a link to. And, I think that's maybe not a community development committee project, but it might be something that's very interesting because we hear from community members at large all the time about the delivery of services, right? It's the thing that gets people worked up the most, either the apportionment of services or they feel that services aren't being adequately delivered. That seems like doesn't seem through the reading that you shared with us that we have to devote a hugely significant proportion of our budget to getting a really significant buy-in and from a lot of different people, from a lot of voices. And that might be something outside of this that we look at as well.
Yeah, and so, I don't know, like, for instance, in New York City, which is very different than Orono.
Well, no.
But they have, for instance, there's like, I think it's broken up by wards and there's a certain portion of the budget goes to participatory budgeting that creates, this chunk of that then the individual projects are proposed within the wards. And you could imagine some sort of scenario like that, where there's a certain portion of the budget, and then you think about geographic dispersion of those projects or ways to kind of create different groups that make public proposals. And there's a lot of moving parts, but it is potentially a way to generate that direct engagement with government, get people really excited about processes of government, to give them some sort of venue in which they can become educated about how government works, and they have some skin in the game. There's some stakes. They can potentially get something for their community or something for their street or something for the town as a whole. So I think the key there is to set it up in such a way that there's broad inclusion and you're not leaving anybody out, or it doesn't feel like it's this kind of foregone conclusion that certain members of the community are going to prevail.
Yeah.
I was just to Megan's comments, I guess it feels like scope creep on this original conversation to me. We've gone from should we increase pay to increase diversity, and now you're talking about we should change our voting process to be able to better educate the voting population, which is great intention. I am curious. I mean, we do only have one night of Meet the Candidate. What kind of viewership do we get from that? Do we have any idea?
I don't have.
Because again, it's back to interest level. And I guess we're trying to spur that, but at the end of the day, a lot of people are purposely not engaged with, so I don't know that we do 6 events between whatever time frame. Does that engage everyone? Or, I mean, and the candidate night is posted too. So like how many views are, I feel like we're maybe trying to climb this mountain and we're trying to really force something here that people have their own interest. And, I feel like the process to some degree is put out there. It's like you said, you were here for however many years and don't even know if you voted, don't even know. And that's how people function in life, I think. And I don't think you're alone. So I don't know.
But I wish I'd been better engaged. I wish that I had known who anyone was that was, I do know that I did vote in at least one municipal election, and I did vote for somebody that later on in life got to know better and realized that is not somebody that I would have ever voted for. But I just picked a name out of a hat because I didn't know who anyone was. So, that was a big lesson to me. And so when you talk about scope creep, Leo, and you said earlier, like I wasn't on council when we had this conversation. Yes, and the conversation did start about money, but I think the central point of the conversation was we were striving to find a way to make this more accessible so that more people could be represented on this council. And I feel very strongly that, like I said in the meeting last week, like just because it's available doesn't mean it's accessible. And so, when you just continue on business as usual, well, it's always been this way, and are people even engaged, and da, 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 da. Yes, I hear all that, and I understand totally where it's coming from. And I also believe very strongly that that is how you just remain, like, this is probably one of the more diverse councils that's ever existed in this town. And it's really only by age, let's be honest, and maybe a little bit of socioeconomic background, but like, we don't have a diverse representative. So what I'm saying is, like, if we just continue business as usual, how long is it gonna take before people are adequately represented in this town in a variety of different ways? And so my goal here isn't to climb a mountain and make things more complicated than they need to be. My goal here is like, how do we open up town government so that people who work, like me, I was a young, very politically engaged person, had been my whole life. How do we capture that person who's out there somewhere in this town right now, who could be running for office or serving on a board or doing volunteer work for the town? Like, how do we bring everybody in? And I don't think what we've been doing has been working to the level that it could be working, with some very probably minor looks at different ways that we do things.
You say this is a diverse, and I think that's where I was, the other issue. I think it is fairly diverse, but maybe it is just age, and some socioeconomic. I think about 2 elections ago, and that seemed like an even more diverse slate of candidates. And I think that's ultimately what we're trying for. Like, we want people to run, but we obviously don't determine who gets voted in. You have to get the votes and whatnot. But I think we've had pretty diverse candidate slates, and this past one where we were put on, that one, it seemed like until like the 11th hour, nobody was even running. Then all of a sudden, hey, no one's running, we need someone in here. So people step forward, but and maybe the diversity, I think the diversity was okay for that too.
My question is like, why can't we just try more things? What's the harm? What's the harm in trying to do whatever we can do to see if we can like open it up more, if we can make government more accessible in general, not just people running and serving, but just even knowing how to engage us.
No harm. What's the trade? But it's a trade-off, because it's work that's got to be done. What work doesn't get done to do that? I guess so. No harm. Absolutely.
So I had a,
Sorry.
Oh, I was gonna say,
I was
Yeah.
going to cut across with a tiny fact, which is I looked, and Candidates Night from this year has 526 views on Facebook.
Wow.
So there's a piece of data, more than we would have thought.
so I had a sort of a question returning to some of the information you presented here. Not about timing, although I agree with that. Maybe timing is something we should look at. Actually, I guess it's related to timing, which is that if we were to lump municipal elections into one of the bigger elections, I'm interested in this partisan section here. I mean, you said many consider nonpartisan elections a point of pride. Remains considerable scholarly critique of their use in relationship to minority representation. The person you cite just says scholars have wondered whether nonpartisan elections advantage middle class business interests, et cetera. Have they done more than wonder, or is there some more specific, I guess, data around whether or not that does that?
Yeah, so specifically, the issue that they've zeroed in on is the way that voters get the information they need in order to make decisions. And as Councilor Kenny has pointed out, a lot of times people are making the decisions on the basis of limited information.
Yeah.
Even if somebody's voting in a local election, they might not be steeped in the candidates and their positions. They might not have attended the candidates night. So it's a heuristic for them. It's a shortcut. And in instances in which they don't have that shortcut, they won't vote, right? They'll fill out the rest of the ballot, but they won't vote in those races. And if I put on my university hat for a second, I hear this all the time from students that students, they know CD2, they know who they want to vote for governor, they're engaged enough in the primaries that they want to know who, that they know who they want to vote for. But those local races, they don't know, they haven't attended the candidates night, and they haven't been able to easily find the information somewhere about where candidates for council or school board stand. And so they don't vote. So it's not perfect, but the issue is that without party identification, serving as, somebody knows, well, I basically align myself with the policies of the Democrats or the Republicans, or this person's a Green Independent, that's exciting to me. They just don't have the ability to make that decision, and they don't make it.
No, thank you.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been thinking about the ways that in fact party politics also can predefine the scope of the debate and the conversation being had, that can actually, and has also been one of the factors shoving out certain positions and certain kinds of candidates, because parties can predefine what's even being talked about and what matters.
Yeah, and particularly with students, it's thinking about my students and their distaste for the two-party system, and they feel like it kind of limits the scope of options. And I can see it being a detriment too, that, maybe one of the things they like about Maine is less rabid affiliation with a specific political party. That when somebody is using the resources they have at their disposal to make a decision with very limited information, something is better than nothing.
Yeah.
And we can even see it anecdotally in results. You look at the town election results and you see people voting in the primary or people voting for Congress, and then you see the numbers drop off once you get to those municipal races.
I wonder if a very low hanging fruit thing that we could provide to candidates is when we're drafting bios to put on the town website, like a series of questions that encourages people to write just a little bit about what their policy ideas are, and just provides a little more framework, and hopefully would increase the length of those bios such that there would be more information there about what the candidates thought and what their stance on things was. And then hopefully folks would have the opportunity, if they're readers rather than people who want to sit through a hour-and-a-half long candidates night, could get that information that way.
Yeah, I was thinking something along the same lines, because I think about the ways, I think of the pros and cons of having partisan identification as part of the council process. And I would say that my personal, my political views definitely inform the way that I make decisions on this council. But also in the same breath, to identify myself simply as the party that I'm registered with does not tell the story of how pissed I often am in my own party and pushing them farther, and not, so there's a lot of things about being identified with my political party that I actually would not like, because I don't think it gives the full impression of my personal political values that do guide the decisions I make on council. So that is like a very complicated gray, area. I mean, in a merge, I was pain in the ass, maybe you've heard, but you know what I'm saying? So it's like, if you just have a letter next to your name, are you automatically identified with the most centrist version of that letter? And is that a problem? Or in some case, I don't know. So that it does open up a lot of cans of worms. However, I think that there's a lot of value in at least looking at what questions could we perhaps ask candidates to address? Because part of my complaint about candidates night, no, Cheryl, is not that I want it to be a debate, but 2 minutes, it's not substantive. It's not substantive unless you come prepared to give a substantive answer, which most candidates don't, just because they don't even know, or they're like, whoa, this is overwhelming or something. You barely get through your introductory remarks and your time is up, and it is not substantive enough, and to really get to know how people would approach the job. So is there some other thing that we can do to capture more about these candidates for the public?
I'm not really dissenting, but I would make the distinction that serving is not hiring. So when the town manager hires a person for a job, she goes through a series of protocols. We've given directive as a council to look for diverse candidates. It was part of our DEI discussion. Serving is in many ways self-motivated. It must be self-motivated. And if we empower the town to recruit candidates, or we as counselors empower ourselves in the mission of recruitment, we are institutionalizing a power structure that may be much more diverse than we realize. And I'm mindful of the point that Leo made, that every time we ask the town to do something, we're taking staff time away from something else. There's a bottom line cost there. But I'm also wary of increasing the institutional authority of these town systems, because I think it limits the kind of voices that can come up from the grassroots.
I think I agree with that. But I think the question remains, what are we incentivizing with the structures that we have? And how can, not necessarily create more work for ourselves, but can we make changes like timing or something that can remove barriers that might otherwise exist? And the only other thing I wanted to say was that the reason that I was sort of connecting the timing question with the partisan question was that I was wondering if lumping these elections together actually does incentivize increased partisanship in the municipal election, when you have the ballots then all sort of smushed together from top to bottom.
Yeah. Yeah, I think from the point of view of the voter, right, there would definitely be some priming that would happen. And we see that with, I don't know, if you have a ballot question that's paired with a contentious election, right, that's going to shift the dynamics of how people make that decision. So I think it's an important consideration.
That's why bear baiting always ends up on certain ballots, right? Drives people to the polls.
I think we identified a number of issues that we want to explore further. And community development is one place we can do that, but it's been a great discussion. There's some really good ideas come out and some further thought that has to be given to it. We ready to kind of wind this discussion down?
Yeah.
Move on?
Thank you.
Again for being here. I really appreciate it.
Yeah,
Especially earlier time sitting through us talk.
No, my pleasure. And if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out. If I'm not the person, I can probably find the person.
That's good to know.
Yeah, no problem.
Thanks. So we have public comments section on our agenda, and I'm not sure we have any public to comment.
We have one person, no hand.
Okay. So in that case, we'll move on to an executive session pursuant to 36 MRSA, paragraph 841. I don't know how to say that. To consider a request for a property tax abatement based on poverty and or disability. And it's order 22, it's number 2022-002. So if I could have a motion to go into executive session for that specific purpose. So, and a second.
Second.
All those in favor? 7 in favor.
So we usually would end the recording at this point. We are gonna come out and ask you to take action on a poverty abatement. We would include that as part of the written minutes. Is that acceptable to everyone? So I'm gonna go ahead and end the meeting.
Sounds safest.
You know me.
Night, Nancy. Thank you.
Just hit it with a hammer. That'll do it.
They call it percussive maintenance.